I wonder what images unity brings to mind for you. Maybe it's memories of school uniform, which were meant to develop a unity and a sense of belonging. Or if not school uniform, then maybe you've served in the armed services. Or it might be a sense of having worked together with others to achieve a common purpose or goal. The dictionary defines unity as something of oneness, of harmony between people. And I want to reflect this morning from that first reading we had from the Acts of the Apostles on unity as it is seen in that reading and what it might say to us today. We began that chapter 2 by reading that the disciples were all together in one place. Remember, this is 120 of them, not just the 12 of the 12 apostles. They had spent the time between Ascension and Pentecost together, watching, praying, no doubt talking, and it was men and women, as we read together last week. And it's ironic to read that today because, of course, we are all together in myriad places. We're not all together in one place, partly because of lockdown, partly because this is a deanery service, and so we're joining from across the deanery as a whole. But we are not together in one place. And that is a real sense of sorrow for us. But it also gives us an opportunity to think together in one place digitally for a while. So we're thinking about Pentecostal unity and what that looks like. Unity is not something that is necessarily peaceful. Think of that song that some of us might have sung in some years ago, the Spirit of God, unseen as the wind, gentle as is the dove. Yes, God's Spirit may be, but he doesn't have to be. We read in the Acts of the Apostles that there was a sound as of a rushing wind. It might be something like the cyclone that recently occurred in the Bay of Bengal that was very briefly in our news headlines. A wind which caused huge damage to life, limb, and livelihood. A wind that destroyed people's homes and their communities. Wind is something that we can't see. We can harness it in wind turbines, but we can't control it. A strong wind, if you're out in a strong wind, I'm not sure that peaceful is the word that I would necessarily choose to use. And then we heard that there was looking as if it was tongues of fire. Think of the Australian bushfires that began this year, seriously damaging to life and limb again. We can start a fire, but once started, it's very hard to control. A number of years ago, when I was living in Tanzania, we had a fire that started from my rubbish pit, and it caused huge damage in the community in which we lived because we just couldn't stop it. There was a wind and there was fire. And if you get too close to fire, of course, it causes damage. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Spirit is destructive in the way that cyclones and fires are. But I am suggesting that we shouldn't think of the Spirit as so peaceful, as in the dove in my image here, that the status quo isn't challenged with no upset caused. Look instead at the fire and the furnace that burns out the impurities. So if the unity that the Spirit brings isn't necessarily peaceful, I would suggest that this unity is peaceable. The people who gathered on that first day came from countries all around the Mediterranean. They were people who had left Israel and Judea during the exile and had spread the whole way across into Europe. And yet here they were for the Feast of Pentecost, the first of the harvest, or the second of the harvest festivals, 50 days after Passover. And here they are, hearing what God is doing. The Spirit doesn't discriminate about who hears, but he enables all to do so. The Spirit enables people to hear in their heart language. Yes, there would have been a common language across the empire, but these people hear in the language that they speak in their homes, their heart language. And that's essential. If we're going to know what God is doing, we need to hear about what God is doing in a language that makes sense to us. Now, for many of us, that's not an issue. But around the world, there are many countries where education happens in a different language from the language spoken in the home. And there are homes in this land where that is the case. So how are those people going to hear in their heart language? What language does the church use? The Spirit is peaceable. He speaks the language of hearts in order to communicate God's good news. Unity doesn't equal uniformity. The prophet Joel, in the part of the reading that where Peter is preaching his sermon, speaks of children, the young, women, slaves, all of whom were outsiders, are given a place at the table. The old men would have been there anyway, but everyone else has gifts too. God's Spirit comes to each one, but with different gifts. And there are just a few mentioned here. There are many more elsewhere. There are different ways, though, of communicating: prophecy, dreams, visions, and signs. So if it doesn't equal uniformity, it does equal welcome and opportunity. This isn't a closed door unity, but one where the door is more widely open than would have been so in the time of the local community, either the one that Joel was speaking to, or even the one that Peter preaches to. All are welcomed. All are encouraged to join in with what God is doing. And the result of this unity, each one hears them speaking about God's deeds of power. And we read later on in verse 41 of chapter 2 that those who were welcomed and baptized were 3,000 that day. So I wonder today what our unity could mean. Firstly, are we too aware of the Spirit's power, willing to allow him to work in the lives of individuals and of the church as a whole? Are we aware of the call to live peaceably with one another, communicating in heart languages God's good news? In other words, communicating in a way that our hearers understand God's good news in the context in which we find ourselves. Are we willing to recognize different gifts, different ways of worshipping, different approaches, but to see one Spirit behind all? Are we people of open doors? One of the interesting things of this time has been seeing the number of people who have accessed online worship or who have searched prayer. There have been hundreds and millions of people who have searched prayer in Google during this lockdown, not just for our nation, but for the nations of the world. Open doors that enable us to communicate God's good news, enabling and assisting one another to join in with what God is doing. That may be different today to our expectations than even just a few months ago, but it's still the same good news. It's still the good news of the love of God in Jesus for each and every one. And the result of this unity, a unity that is peaceable and a unity that is welcoming and embraces opportunity, well, who knows? Watch this space. Amen.